Welcome, dear listener. Settle into a place where your body can rest and your thoughts can wander as gently as falling leaves. Let the world outside grow quiet for a while. The story you're about to hear is not hurried, not loud. It moves. At the rhythm of a slow, deep breath. It is a story about a man and a garden that only blooms in the smallest of moments, in that stillness between seasons when the air is neither autumn nor winter, when the leaves hesitate, suspended in their journey to the ground, and the frost lingers just at the edge of the morning. And it is a story about her, the one who comes to him, always at that time, stepping into the hush as if she belongs to it. So close your eyes if you wish. Feel the warmth of your blanket, and let us walk together into the garden between seasons. Rowan had learned over the years to feel the precise moment when the garden shifted. It was never announced by a sudden gust or a grand display. It came softly, like the faint hush that falls over a room when the last candle burns low. Each year, he would stand among the ivy-wrapped walls and sense it, that fragile pause between the last breath of autumn and the first stirrings of winter. The air would turn still, as though the whole garden were holding itself in a quiet sigh. His garden was hidden, not by design but by time. An old courtyard tucked behind crumbling brick, its gate so overgrown with climbing roses that few would think to push it open. Here, Rowan tended to what others might call forgotten plants, pale chrysanthemums, clusters of faded hydrangea, and ivy so green it seemed to drink from shadows. But he knew them differently. To him, each stem and petal carried its own slow heartbeat, and he cared for them with the patience of someone who understood that beauty had its own clock. And every year, in this fragile hinge of the seasons, the garden bloomed in its own strange way. The leaves, gold and brittle, would remain caught on their branches a little longer. The frost, eager to settle, would linger in the clouds instead. The air would taste of apples long since gathered and wood smoke drifting from unseen chimneys. It was in this pause, this breath held between what had been and what would come, that he would wait for her. He never spoke her name aloud. In truth, he wasn't sure if he had ever been meant to know it, but he knew her presence in the same way he knew the weight of the air before the first snow, a quiet certainty that she was near. Rowan would move through the garden slowly, brushing away the last curled petals, adjusting the stones on the moss path, tracing his fingertips over the frostless leaves. His mind would wander, imagining the moment he might see her again. He never expected it. And yet every year she came. And so, on this day, as the light thinned into that soft golden gray, Rowan stood by the far wall, watching the last beams of sunlight spill through the bare branches. The air was cool, but not cold. The leaves, trembling, seemed undecided in their descent. And in that stillness, he let his breath slow, his hands rest against the stone, and his thoughts drift to her, wondering if this year, too, she would walk the garden's path in the silence between autumn and winter. The garden had grown quieter as the light faded. A few birds, stubbornly lingering before their journey south, rustled in the ivy. Somewhere beyond the gate, a faint breeze moved through the empty lanes, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Rowan was kneeling beside the low stone wall where the hellebores grew, running his hand over their dark, sturdy leaves. When he heard it, the sound he had been listening for without quite realizing it, a step, then another. Soft, deliberate, the crisp sound of shoes brushing over dry leaves. He lifted his head slowly, not wanting to startle the moment, not wanting to break the fragile air that had settled over the garden. The footsteps drew closer, measured, unhurried, as though the one walking knew there was no need to rush. Rowan rose, brushing his hands over his coat sleeves, and turned toward the narrow archway of roses. and there she was. She stepped into the garden as though crossing into a dream, her figure, outlined in the dimming light. Her hair caught the last pale gold of the sun, and her coat, the color of deep moss, swayed softly with her movements. They didn't speak at first, they never did. The first moments were always for quiet. It was as though the garden itself needed to reacquaint them, to remind them of the silence they shared. Her eyes moved over the garden with the ease of someone returning to a familiar room. She noticed the ivy's new reach, the way the chrysanthemums had leaned toward the low wall, the small dish of water Rowan kept for the winter birds. She walked along the path, her fingers grazing the tops of the faded hydrangeas, pausing to breathe in the faint, earthy scent of the soil. When she reached him, she offered a small smile, the kind that belonged entirely to the person who received it. "Another year," she said softly, her voice low enough that it felt like part of the garden's own hush. "Another year." Rowan replied, his own tone matching the slow warmth of hers. They stood together, letting the silence fill the spaces between their words. The world beyond the walls might have been busy, hurried, already swept up in winter's demands. But here, the moments stretched out, folding into one another like petals in the half-light. The garden, sensing her return, seemed to settle deeper into its pause. Somewhere above, a leaf loosened, drifted halfway down, and then caught on another branch, as if even gravity was reluctant to end the moment. Rowan felt the shift inside him the same as every year. Not sudden joy, not longing, but the quiet reassurance that she was here again, and that the days ahead, however brief, would be filled with the slow companionship they both seemed to understand. Later, they would walk the garden together, but for now it was enough to simply stand in the fading light, hearing the gentle rhythm of her breath against the soft rustle of the leaves. The next morning, the garden awoke under a pale, pearled sky. Mist hung low between the branches, softening the outlines of every leaf and stone. It was the kind of morning where even sound seemed to arrive wrapped in cotton, a distant crow's call muffled, the drip of dew from ivy leaves falling without. Echo. Rowan was already in the garden, kneeling to brush away the thin layer of leaves that had gathered on the moss path overnight. He felt her before he saw her, that subtle awareness, like recognizing the faint scent of a flower before turning toward it. She stepped through the arch quietly, her boots leaving small prints in the damp earth. She carried a folded shawl over one arm, its fabric soft and worn, the kind of thing that carried the memory of every place it had been used. "You're here early," she said gently, her voice nearly matching the hush of the mist. "I didn't want to miss the morning light," Rowan replied. "It only looks this way for an hour, if that." She glanced around, taking in the muted gold of the leaves, the way the fog made each bloom look as though it had been painted in watercolors. "Then we should walk," she said, as though it were the most natural suggestion in the world. They moved slowly along the path, her steps matching his without effort. Sometimes their shoulders brushed, just enough for the warmth to register, just enough for the air between them to feel changed. She asked about the plants, and Rowan spoke softly about each one, how the hellebores stayed green through the frost, how the ivy had once climbed high enough to touch the chimney, how the pale chrysanthemums seemed to catch the light in a way no other flower could. Her gaze lingered on the petals, but often, he noticed, it would return to him, a brief glance, a quiet smile, as if she were making sure he was still there. Beside her Data-T, the far edge of the garden, where the wall was low enough to see the fields beyond, they stopped. The grass there was brittle with cold, and the last leaves clung stubbornly to a tall oak. "It feels like the world holds its breath here," she murmured, her fingers brushing over the stone wall. "That's why I stay," Rowan said. "Out there, the seasons push each other forward. Here, They make room for each other. They stood there for a while, listening to the faint sound of a stream somewhere beyond the wall, watching a single leaf turn slowly in the air before it landed. When they began walking back, her hand slipped lightly through the crook of his arm. It was not a grand gesture, but it changed the way the path felt beneath his feet, as though every stone, every fallen leaf had been placed there just for this walk. They didn't speak again until they reached the center of the garden. There, under the branches of an old apple tree, she paused and looked up at him. The mist was lifting, and a thin beam of sunlight fell across her hair. "Tell me," she said softly, "what you do when I'm not here." Rowan's answer was simple, but it carried the weight of truth. "I wait for this." She didn't reply. With words, only a slow smile, and a glance that felt like an unspoken promise that she understood completely. The days that followed unfolded like pages in a book where each word was meant to be read slowly, each sentence savored before moving to the next. Mornings began with a veil of frost along the garden wall, delicate and white, melting the moment the first sunlight reached it. Afternoons were steeped in that muted gold that only appeared this time of year, when the sun drifted low and the shadows stretched long, and gentle evenings carried the faint smell of smoke from faraway chimneys, the scent curling over the walls. And settling in the folds of their scarves, Rowan and she moved through it all together, rarely rushing, rarely filling the air with more than a handful of words. Their conversations had a way of circling back to the garden, its plants, its changes, the quiet ways it endured and transformed. One afternoon, they sat side by side on the old bench beneath the apple tree. Its branches were nearly bare now, a few stubborn leaves trembling above them. The air had the weight of stillness, the kind that made every sound a bird's wing, a breath feel magnified. She leaned back, her gaze fixed on the far wall. "It's strange," she murmured, "how this place always feels like we've never left it, even though so much time has passed." Rowan turned his head, watching the way her breath curled faintly in the cool air. "I think it's because the garden only wakes for us," he said quietly, "like it's waiting too." Her eyes met his, that unhurried glance that stayed just a moment longer than necessary. In that look, there was no question, no rush to define what lived between them. It was enough to simply know that it was there, woven into every pause. Rooted in every step they took together. As the light shifted toward evening, a single flake of snow drifted down between them. It landed on the bench, melting almost instantly, leaving a tiny circle of damp wood behind. She smiled faintly. "It's almost time," she said, not with sadness, but with the soft acceptance of someone who understood that some things only exist because they cannot last forever. Rowan nodded. "Not yet," he said. And there was the smallest trace of warmth in his tone, a warmth that promised he would not waste the moments that remained. They sat there until the sky deepened into the soft blue of early night, their hands resting near enough to feel the faint heat between them, their silence holding more than words could carry. It was in that quiet, with the bare branches above, and the garden breathing slowly around them, that they both knew, without saying it, that what they shared belonged wholly to this threshold between seasons. The frost arrived slowly that year. It didn't sweep in with a single, sharp night, but crept along the edges of leaves and petals, touching them lightly, as if testing their readiness for winter's hand. Each morning, Rowan and she walked the garden together. Their steps were slow, their voices softer still, not because they needed to whisper, but because the garden seemed to be listening. The chrysanthemums had faded now, their colors paling to soft parchment tones. The hellebores stood quietly in their corner, their leaves catching a thin shimmer of ice. Overhead, the bare branches traced delicate lines against the pale sky, like an old ink drawing left in the cold. They didn't speak much of parting. Perhaps because they both knew that their time was measured by the season's own rhythm, and words could not slow it. Instead, they filled the hours with simple things, walking the moss path together, pausing to watch a robin hop among the fallen leaves, sitting side by side on the bench while the low sunlight bathed the garden in quiet gold. One afternoon, a soft wind moved through the garden, carrying with it a faint scattering of snowflakes. They weren't enough to settle, just drifting specks that caught the light before vanishing on the air. She tilted her head back, eyes half closed as one landed in her hair. Rowan reached out, not quite touching, but close enough to see it melt against the warmth. "It's coming," she said softly. "Yes," he replied, his voice low, as if answering both her and the season itself. They began walking again, their arms brushing now and then, the fabric of her coat whispering against his sleeve. At the far end of the path, she slowed, and he matched her pace without thinking. They stood there for a long time, watching the light fade across the wall, listening to the faint creak of branches in the cold. It was the kind of moment where nothing needed to be said, where the silence itself was the language they both understood. When they finally turned back toward the bench, Rowan offered his arm. She took it without hesitation, her hand warm through the wool of his sleeve, and they walked on, two figures moving through the garden's last, unhurried breaths before winter. The day the frost finally claimed the garden began in deep stillness. Even the air seemed to pause before moving, and the light came slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the hush that lay over the earth. Rowan stood by the gate before dawn, his breath curling in the pale air. The roses that climbed the arch were rimmed in silver, each petal touched by a thin edge of ice. The moss path was firm beneath his boots, its softness hidden under a crystal sheen. When she arrived, her steps were quieter than ever, not out of caution, but as though she too felt the need to tread gently in the garden's final waking moments. Her coat was buttoned high, and her scarf, the color of winter skies, framed her face in soft folds. She smiled as she reached him, but it was the kind of smile wrapped in knowing, a smile that understood the weight of the day. Together, they walked the garden one last time. The frost had settled into every corner, making the faded flowers seem delicate enough to shatter at a touch. The air was sharp, but their steps were slow, lingering at each turn in the path. They paused by the apple tree, its bare branches etched against the pale sky. A single leaf clung to the highest branch, its edges trembling in the breeze. Rowan glanced at her. She met his eyes, and for a moment, everything, the season, the garden, the quiet between them, seemed to fold into a single, unbroken thread. They didn't speak of when they would see each other again. That had never been the way of their meetings. It was enough to know they would. Somewhere in the next pause between autumn and winter, she would return. As they reached the gate, she rested her gloved hand against the old wood for a moment, her gaze drifting over the frost-touched blooms. Then she looked back at him, her eyes holding that same soft promise that had carried them through each season's end. "Until the leaves pause again," she said quietly. Rowan nodded. Until then, she stepped through the gate, and her footsteps faded into the still morning. Rowan stood there for a while, watching the mist gather in the lane, listening to the faint echo of her presence in the quiet. When he finally turned back, the garden felt different, not empty, but resting. Its colors were muted now, its blooms folded in on themselves, as if settling in for a long, peaceful sleep. Rowan walked to the center and sat on the bench beneath the apple tree. The air was cold, but there was a warmth in his chest that lingered, carried by the memory of her hand on his arm, her smile in the pale light. And as the frost deepened and the garden exhaled its last breath of the season, Rowan closed his eyes, letting the quiet take him. knowing that somewhere the next meeting was already waiting in the slow turn of the year.